welcome. You are listening to Classical Stuff You Should Know.
It's us.
We're a podcast about classical things. Old books, old thoughts, old paintings, old poetry, old stuff. And we are trying to bring the world of education to you in the most painless way possible. We're coming out of Veritas Academy in Austin, Texas. At least two of us are working there currently. One of those people is Graham Donaldson.
Hello.
I am AJ Hannenberg, and we are joined by our compatriot, Thomas Maggie.
Hi, so I'm that third one. Yes.
He is that third one,
Yeah.
Which brings us to the topic of today's episode, which is the Mag bibliography. It is a retrospective, if you will.
I don't know how you come up with these things like that.
On his time at Veritas, or so I'm led to understand.
Yeah, so we made reference to this in our opening, maybe, again, these...
It all blurs into one.
All blurs together, and time is a flat circle. But probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, in our opening, we just made reference to, for the entirety of this podcast, it's been 3 of us at Veritas talking together. And then at this point, it's been since the end of May, one of us is no longer with Veritas. And so I wanted to at least comment on that. So, for some of you listeners, this will not be a classical work that I'm talking about. This is more of a topic related to classical education itself. AJ's trying to quietly open a drink, and it's going very poorly.
I think I pulled it off.
Do you actually, though?
Yeah.
I never know with these microphones what they're going to pick up, so There's no telling. AJ has to drink to make it through my episodes, so look.
That is a bubbly.
It is a bubbly.
That's what it's called.
It's bubbly.
It's just one U and one B.
Well,
how do you pronounce it?
Probably a long U. Bubly.
Bubly.
I like that even better.
Bubbly. Bubbly.
So these are... This
is why we never do 3 episodes in one sitting.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, this is great. No, it's just whenever it's my episode. Most of these are, at one level, listener, you should have questions as to why I'm on this podcast in the first place. And most of that reason is they asked me to guest appear on one episode, and then I never left. So that was episode 10, and then they never got rid of me. So sorry about that. They had guest appearances in the first 10, but...
You were the harmony that made the melody.
That makes no sense. They had a guest appear in the first 9, and that person did not return, even though her episode was better than mine. So here we are. But my time at Veritas, I was dean of student life. So while Graham and AJ are like teachers and actually like read the things they talk about in these episodes, that hasn't been my job during my time at Veritas. I worked with the students, so my involvement was more related to student congress and class trips, and we have a house system at the school and intramurals. It's like competitions between those different houses. It's the fun stuff. School is fun. Also, learning is fun, I promise. But it's the fun stuff that happens outside the classroom is one way that I think about it. So we have a dean of academics, and I was dean of student life. So academics handles classroom stuff. Student life is like not classroom stuff. I'm the person who uploads our YouTube videos, so you can blame me that we're like 4 weeks behind at this point. But in our early part of having to do the YouTube videos is going back and listening to a lot of our old ones, and either AJ or Graham, one of them, would quip that I was the ombudsman of fun, which I always, listening to it, like, listener, I understand that I come off as like a bump on a log, and I know that it probably comes across as a joke, that being the title, but many of the activities that are planned are the fun activities around school. And as I guess we'll get into for the episode, I probably focus on student life in a way that's different from maybe the way other people think about student life. And that's most of what I want to talk about here, or just some things I've learned about student life from being here that, again, I know many of our listeners work in classical schools, which have student life departments, or people, there are many people who work at colleges which also have student life departments. So these are just my thoughts from reflecting on 5 years of being a part of that function.
So buckle up for knowledge. Cracking eggs of wisdom. Magby, bringing the heat.
Yeah, because again, I've always had to, like, everything that I've brought to this podcast is something I've read on my own time in a way that, again, you all like teach many of the books that you present. So finally I get a topic that's like a thing I actually have done for a few years.
Hey, you did Euclid.
Yes, I guess I should. This is kind of a reference to that. So I think I gave notice in January that I wasn't going to be returning to Veritas, and then announced in March, I think, that I wouldn't be coming back. And then end of May was just whenever the school year ended, was the end of my time here. I'm in a Master's of Science of Data Science program. So I'm learning math, which kind of prompted the Euclid and the I forgot the name of the other one, but the whether math is fun or not episodes, because I think math is really super interesting. So that's what I'm studying now, and I know we have a few like math listeners out there. So if anyone wants to reach out, let's talk about matrices. They're great. Cool.
Euclid, email us at classical stuff.
Thank you. Good.
At the guys at class.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
It's just going to be quips from Graham and AJ for the rest of this episode. I will be curious what Graham and AJ you all have to say about any of these points that I make, since you all are pretty heavily involved with student life as well. We've made reference before. The school has a house system. There are 4 houses: Augustine, Bonhoeffer, Francis, and Mueller. Graham is the dean, so he's the adult head of the House of Francis.
Oh, the 2020-2021 House Cup champions, House
yes,
of Francis.
That's what I meant to say, sorry. And AJ is dean of the 2019-2020. When did you all last? 2018-2019?
I can't remember.
Yeah,
Okay.
no one knows.
Because it's been so long ago. Yeah,
But my house is more about the inner house life.
Wow.
The House
budding-
of Infinite Resignation.
We have a library. We've got free
You do have a
tea.
library.
You do have a library, which
Yeah.
Francis does not.
Francis doesn't have a library.
Francis talks a big game about building some
We do.
badge system.
Yeah.
out that
Oh,
we've
we never
done,
do it.
you know.
It's expensive.
Sorry, I don't think I finished my sentence. That AJ is the dean of the House of Mueller. So we have dean of House of Francis, dean of House of Mueller. So they're also involved in student life. I'll be curious what you think about any of these points. So again, this is just how I've thought about student life for the last 5 years, or some things that I've had to grow into during my time. The title "Student Life" ready for my dumb sentence? It's made of 2 words. So the student in life, nailed it. So I have, I think, 5 points that line up under student and 5 points that fall under the like life part of student life. Because ultimately those are the 2 things that you're focused on in the job. That you're focused on students. That's like an important piece of the job. And then you're focused on this thing, this life thing, this which we'll talk about kind of what that is. And I very much have focused more on the student piece of student life, I'd say, over my last 5 years. AJ and Graham have sometimes made references to me as a counselor. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a licensed professional counselor. But much of my job has been the connection with students and getting to know them so that they can open up about things and help guide them through situations. Something that I have prioritized since starting here is that as dean of student life, I am the dean of all students. Dean of all, like it's not like I'm the dean of, I was a theater kid growing up. I'm not the dean of theater life. I'm not the dean of athletics life. I'm the dean of all student life. So all life. Quite a title, isn't it? So my first thought is that under the student piece, that a job in student life, and you might broaden this out to ministry, or I think anyone who works at a school, that the job is to build a bridge to every single student. That I think it's easy to come into a job like this and have preferences for certain kinds of kids you like, certain groups that you get along with, and there are certain relationships that will be easier to make than others. But the goal should be not to stay just with that group of students, but to show that you're an advocate and show you're a supporter of all students at the school. There's a documentary called Godspeed, the Pace of Being Known. Have you all seen this before?
Nope.
It's the story of this pastor who, before he was a pastor, was in seminary and took a class with Eugene Peterson. And the pastor, I think his name is Matt, I think it's Canlis. I always forget the guy's name. But he was going to be pastor of a megachurch was his goal. He wanted to, it's his phrase he used over and over again, is that he wanted to modernize the church. And he wanted to make these big changes to the church, to like all, Big C church is what he's thinking. And he takes this class with Eugene Peterson, and he is so frustrated by the class because it moves slowly, and it's about reading old books. It's not about how to grow quickly. It's about how to, gaining wisdom more so than it is how do you attract followers. And he's really frustrated by this class at first, but then kind of grows to be interested. And Eugene Peterson challenges him on his goals of changing the entire church, which will eventually lead him to reject this idea of going for the big megachurch, and instead he ends up, go watch the documentary, it's only like 40 minutes, he ends up in Scotland. He gets to Scotland and is assigned this small little parish church, and he shows up to the church and he's looking around and says, where's my office? And he's told promptly, there is no office because your parishioners aren't in this building. Your parishioners are outside of this building. And that's something, again, to connect this with the job is to build these bridges to every student. The goal of a day is not, did you get a lot of emails answered? Did you accomplish your tasks for the given day? But it's, did you reach out to and build relationships with students? And sometimes they're nearby. We have a common area where people hang out. Sometimes you have to go and find them. But that's, I think, a starting place for this role of student life is building bridges to every single student, not just the ones you connect with very quickly. Any thoughts on the first before I keep going?
How to go for the guy in Scotland?
Very well. He made a documentary, right? How did it go for him? It was really hard at first, and it frustrated him. It moved slower than he wanted it to, but he eventually gets to this point, and he talks about it, that he's giving a sermon, and he realizes that the sermon he's giving isn't just, here are my best thoughts on pick the topic. It's, here's a message that Mary and John need to hear. He eventually realizes he's embedded in this community, and that's more valuable to him than him having 5,000 people show up on a Sunday morning. So things eventually work out well, but it's a painful process for him, which I think is a piece of ministry, right? It's not always easy.
So you see that pastoral side of student life?
Sure.
Like if you're drawing the connection that like this person who's a pastor shepherding souls in Scotland, that is something that is drawn into student life.
Yes. And again, my point from before is that I think different people who get into student life will focus on either the life or the student part. And the life part is the putting on events and activities and things that people can come to. It's the, it's
prom and dances and games and intramurals.
And some people are really drawn to that stuff and are really good at putting them on. And again, that's one way to accomplish student life. I'll talk about it in a little bit. I think it's an important part of the
life of the school.
To have events and activities like that. But definitely what I brought to this, what I was more interested in was the student piece, the connection one-on-one. Because again, I think you can put on big, fun events that don't reach or connect anyone, right? Mm-hmm. So yes, I would, I'll say later that, anyway, it's pastoral in a general sense, but I was not a pastor during any of this time, so I would say that. And part of that is in the school context and in the high school context, you are an authority figure. And if your first conversation with someone is a confrontation, it's going to be difficult for you to, one, have a good first encounter be the confrontation, and also that paints you as the discipline guy, or it paints you as a tough teacher who's just out to enforce rules. I guess, do you all find that in the classrooms might be different?
Yeah, the thing is it's easier because in that classroom, I find that like if my first impression with like a freshman that I don't teach is me saying like, hey, tuck your shirt in, and they're like, I hate that guy.
Right.
I know I'm going to be getting them for 72 hours next year, and that's where the relationship's going to be built. So it's less like the first impression. I don't worry too much about it. I actually kind of like having SL, School of Logic kids, be kind of scared of me.
Yeah, I find it practical for my classroom to be kind of a hard nose the first couple weeks. You need them to be clear that you are going to run your ship and run it well and not mess around with the rules and enforce them consistently.
Sure.
And then because it's far easier to relax the rules later than it is to tighten them up. People don't like that.
But we know we've got structured time where they have to listen to us for a long period of time. Whereas in another instance, you may lose them if that first interaction is not good because you may not be talking to them for 5 weeks or whatever.
And the other thing is that
just because you don't bump into them in the hall or whatever.
Our purpose is not. My purpose is to teach them English and to teach them humanities, and relationship is a big piece of that. But it seems like in student life, the relationship there is absolute forefront.
Yes, because it's what you said before. It's because you don't, like, the student doesn't have to talk to you, and so you become ineffectual if you're only the person who's enforcing rules without them also wanting to come to you to talk about things. Again, that's on the student side of it. If you're focused more on the life side of the cultural events, you can probably get away with not caring about a first impression or not building bridges to every student. But I just think it's something to be careful about in going into a role like that. Mm-hmm. Yes, you need a distance where you're an adult, you're enforcing rules, but you also need to be someone that is trusted and that they're able to go to. Again, this is where it's easier for a youth pastor to fulfill a role like this because they don't usually have the rule side of it unless they're on a retreat or an event or something like that. Youth ministry comes with its own problems. Okay, so thought the first...
Maintaining the goatee, the big one.
Yeah, it's definitely the biggest one. Okay, so the first part on the student side is to build bridges to every student, to not have biases, to care about and want to know all students. There's your obvious statement for the day. But then the second thought ties into that. If I use the phrase bridge to nowhere, does that ring a bell to anyone?
New Jersey.
Oh, is that the one you think of?
I think there's one in Seattle, isn't there?
Tell me more.
They were going to build this big freeway and built an on-ramp to it, and then the funding disappeared, and now they have this big on-ramp that leads to a giant drop-off, and there is nothing there, and they have big cones in the way so that you don't accidentally find yourself on the bridge to nowhere and launch your car off this big launch ramp.
What's the one you're thinking of?
Governor Christie, bridge to nowhere. I don't know. I just remember going to people's house that listen to the news, and that was what was being screamed on TV at that point. I don't know anything about it.
The one I think of is from... apparently there's a whole category of bridges to nowhere. So this is a thing beyond just the few examples we're coming up with. There's one in Alaska from early 2010s, so 2011, 2012. It was a bridge. So there's a ferry between this island and the mainland in Alaska. They wanted to build a bridge instead. The bridge was going to cost $400 million. But what it would end up connecting, so first off, they're already connected by a ferry, but this $400 million bridge would connect the mainland to a city with 50 people. It came under heavy scrutiny and ultimately was canceled. But that's the example I think of. Understandably, people were frustrated by the idea of putting in $400 million to connect a very small island to the rest of Alaska. I'm sure it mattered to those 50 people very much. So thought the second is that if you're going to build bridges to students, you need to then use those bridges. And by which I mean, just in being here, it's easy to get a student to like you. You can be easy on rules. You can be friendly. You can be nice. You can do all those things. But and maybe that friendliness will build a bridge that makes a conversation easier. But if you're not crossing that bridge to have a difficult conversation, you're spending the $400 million without frequent use of that bridge. And that it's wasteful is the wrong word, but it's what's the point of building the bridge if you're not going to actually use it? So does that make sense that it's one thing to be liked by people, and I think that's the kind of stereotype of a youth pastor. But if you're not going to engage in the work of trying to improve students, to get them to a better place, to challenge them, to confront them about things that you learn about them, then what's the point of building that bridge in the first place?
Yes, I mean, so what would be an example? Of crossing the bridge? You mentioned having a hard conversation, but is it also like having a student sort of shoulder a responsity they wouldn't necessarily have done in the first place?
Yeah, sure. But even in that, it's being able to talk about moral categories of needing help done around campus. Someone has an off period and they're not doing anything, but them saying no to it, to be able to have the conversation of, why not? Is this laziness? Are you actually busy and stressed out? Like, that's a tough conversation to have where it's, do you have a good reason for what you're saying? Or are you just responding this way? So that's that's one way of doing it. The other is that in interacting with a student, sometimes you'll notice they're telling jokes that they shouldn't be telling. They're laughing at things that shouldn't be funny. To confront them with your worsening yourself by being engaged in those things. Again, if all that happens is you hear someone tell a dirty joke and your first interaction with them is a confrontation, that's not as effective as that this adult cares about you, that they you have a relationship in the first place, and then they confront you on it. That's what I mean by walking across the bridge.
Gotcha.
Am I being clear on that?
Yes, I was going to make a takes its toll joke, but I couldn't figure it out.
But
bridges and tolls.
We can wait. Yeah. I mean, I got like a few more of these,
gotcha.
So you got plenty of time for sure. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about servant leadership, right? Where the relationship there isn't about amassing a bunch of Magby-loving followers, but capitalizing on that relationship to work change for their sake, not yours.
Yeah, this was the thing from financial advising that you measure the strength of a relationship by the hardest conversation you've had with that person. And so it's one thing to have lots of people who, like you said, like you, think you're funny, want to hang out with you. That doesn't mean you have deep relationships with people. And this isn't not solely a student life thing. Think of your friends. What's the hardest conversation you've had with them? And that's some proxy of closeness to them. And again, what's the way to say it? Like for you two, for the students that come back to see you after they've graduated, it's probably people who have opened up to you about something, or you've given them advice that's really mattered to them. It's not just the ones who are like, AJ and Graham are really fun. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. That's true.
Sometimes you don't know if it's advice if you've said something that's changed their lives, because we do teach them literature and I bring up a lot of things, and you never know what is going to work its way into the soul of a student. And so sometimes they make those visits and you don't know that you had a large
They'll be like, do you remember that class? And they'll like describe it and you'll be like, yeah, it kind of sounds like something I might say. And they're like, and for them, it was absolutely changing. And you're like, cool. But that's more like at that level, it's like common grace, or, it's God's hand as opposed to my master plan or whatever.
Yep.
Or you're doing the same thing year in and year out. So it's
yeah.
So like good on I don't know. Your work is to do as good a job in those lectures as you can. And then
I see it as throwing a whole bunch of spaghetti at the wall and just seeing what sticks.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So build bridges, but then you have to actually walk across those bridges. So again, in any kind of ministry activity where you are, I'm thinking mostly, again, I worked with high schoolers primarily. So that's what I'm thinking primarily for this. But yes, it's good to build connections, to show that you care about who these people are, but also then you have to have those hard conversations and not just be satisfied with the surface level. I tell funny jokes and they think I'm an okay person. Again, part of what, when people view this role in a counseling position, it's because those bridges are built that students will want to come and talk about things that they're going through. There are many stories throughout the years of students opening up about something and then an adult reacting, having a large reaction in response to what a student has said. So like having shock in response to what someone has said. And that almost immediately will shut down future conversation. There's a concept from there's a psychologist named Carl Rogers. That one of his ideas is unconditional positive regard. That's a phrase you all have heard before. Nope. Unconditional positive regard is, again, I'll just read, this is straight the definition: the basic acceptance and support of a person regardless of what the person says or does, especially in the context of client-centered therapy. Client-centered therapy was what Carl Rogers developed. So acceptance and support of a person regardless of what the person says. I think this is wrong.
Yeah.
Just so I start. Okay,
interesting. Because I was like, I don't know how I feel about that.
So the part I agree with of this is, to acceptance and support means you can't be shocked by someone when they say something to you, but you can't support everything that they say or do. Mm-hmm. That, in a student trying to determine like how much, in what way do I talk with this person? Do I talk to them as I do to a peer? Do I talk to them as I do to my teachers? They're going to make mistakes in that. And your job as the adult in the room is to make clear when they've made mistakes. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? And part of it is both. It's not just, I'm an adult, don't talk to me that way. That's not a way to talk. Am I being clear? The point to say is that there should be a positive regard of the student. You should like the students that work at the school that you work at. If you work at a school, you should love your students, to quote Graham's thing that he said many times. But you should.
I think in my defense, the quote was, "Oh my goodness, I have to love them."
Yeah,
if I'm going to do this job properly.
But that's what I'm saying here. But what you're loving is both, yes, who they are right now. It's not always their mistakes. It's who they could be.
Yeah,
and it's seeing through. Everyone will mess up at some point in the year, and most people will have low points during the year. But to see that whatever problem they're going through right now isn't who they'll be 9 months from now, 10 months from now, pick your number. That's what I mean by an unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard for who they could be. That whatever thing that they are talking with you about or having questions about or doubts about, again, this is a Christian school talking about faith or anything like that, it's not being shocked at whatever they say, but it's having a trust that they'll get to somewhere better as a result, both of this conversation and conversations they'll have with parents, church members, things like that.
Yeah. Also, just sort of a benefit of teaching, of being a teacher in a classroom, is we have more of that built in, I know how to talk to this person, that if a student wants to come and talk, outside of class, they do have that like, wait a minute, is it Mr. Donaldson my teacher?
Yes.
What's my relationship with Mr. Donaldson? And there's always that really funny thing that happens after graduation where they come up and they're like, hey, Graham, because they've perceived that, or not perceived, it has been that there is a relationship between teacher and student, where the first name is, part of the relationship is you don't say it because it's too familiar.
Yep.
But now that we're graduated, we can. But there is that, there is a built-in. I don't know, maybe if you felt that there was a built-in relationship with student life, or if every student kind of like was trying to figure that out.
I don't know when you say built-in.
Well, I just mean like
our relationship is established. We're teachers.
Yes.
They come to us. We are authority figures in their life, whereas your role is less
It's more in between.
defined, and you get to define the parameters. In my class, if you aren't in uniform, I'm going to give you a mark. Like it's
Sure, there's the same enforcement of rules. I'm saying that you have, whether they like you or not, they'll be in your classroom for
Right.
an hour
72
or twice
hours,
a week
yeah,
or whatever
yeah,
it is. And in a way that they
could avoid you for 4 years if they wanted to.
and they could. Yeah, and that I think that's the point. And so there's this weird in between of you need to develop this trust if you're going to, again, if you're going to focus on the student side of it, which is like it's harder to do this stuff. It's easier to just put on the events and put on the activities and then not care about the student connection and the opening up. I find that less fulfilling. That makes sense. So that's how I think about it. So that's taken us through the first three of them. Build bridges to every student. Those bridges then need to be used if you're going to actually bridge them. You should have a positive regard for your students, but not just for who they are, but who they could be. And then this fourth one, this is kind of starting to bridge the gap between the student part and the life part. But in planning activities and planning what structures we have at the school, I've had as a guiding principle that I want for every student to feel like they belong at this school. So if you think about like the activities that a typical school has, you'll have, we're in Texas. There is an athletics program at the school, right? And that's going to exist apart from student life and whether anyone plans anything out. We have a fine arts department. Like there are people who are theater kids. They'll be a part of that no matter what. Well, then if you're not into athletics and you're not into fine arts, what do you do? I guess that's the way to frame this. I think this is where something like the club system falls in pretty importantly there, that whatever interest you have, if you can find 6 other kids who are interested, you can start a club for that also, which means that no matter what the thing is that you're interested in, you have an avenue to find people who are also interested in that. And then there's like school time built in for that. The way Veritas structures it, you also have to have a teacher there. So you'll have like a teacher support that you might not get if you're kind of outside of one of those typical pathways of academics, athletics, or fine arts, just to think about those. Any thoughts on that before you all are both club sponsors, I believe. Have you enjoyed your club time?
I do. Oh, yeah, I do. We got Board Game Club, Bad Movie Club.
Fishing club. We had Random Club for a while. We had Dress Down Day Club.
We had Finer Things Club.
Finer Things Club was nice. The Tea Club is still going strong.
Tea Club's still going strong.
We had Literature Club still going.
I dig it. But the point is that if a student wants to engage, wants to be involved, do they have a pathway to do that? And again, that's just being thoughtful about what things are you planning. And and allowing a certain quirkiness, I guess, is maybe the way I would put that. I'll get to that in a little bit.
Like the Studio Ghibli Club.
Yes.
That was a great club for people who...
Still going on? They started back last year. Yeah. Okay, I dig it. So, again, the goal in this programming is to have to find a way where every student can belong if they want to be involved. And again, you'll have a range of student desire to be involved in stuff that the school does, and that's fine. This bridge then between the student piece of it and the life part of it is that when you're planning events, when you're planning activities, to oversimplify, you kind of have 2 ways of going about it. You can either have parents run everything, and parents will put on an immaculately presented event. They'll follow all the schedules that you set out, and like the event itself will be great. So when you look at our SL dances, they it's mostly parent run. They do a great job with all that work. The other side of it is to have students run those events instead. And there are certain challenges that come with having students run an event as opposed to adults. Students are harder to wrangle, to schedule, to make sure that they meet certain deadlines. And this, I'm speaking as an extreme. Over the course of 5 years, this got much, much better to the point where our students put on excellent events. The point being, you can pick one of those two, kind of the professional path where the event is perfect, or the path where students are doing most of the work, which will come with more problems than the professional path. The student path is better than the professional path. That's my only comment on this one. That I don't think the goal of putting on events is just to have great events. It's what impact will that have on the people working on those projects for having put in the time to put them on. To be more, again, we run this by, Veritas runs this by having a student congress that puts on these different events. And there are, when I first came here 5 years ago, I ran almost all the events by myself. And it led to, I was working all the time, and my events weren't that great because I'm not very cool. To 5 years in, students run almost everything. And you just get you see that growth over time of passing things off to students. They become more engaged with them. They're more creative than one person can be. Anyway, the challenges that come with having students plan events are worth it, is the only point that I'm trying to get to with that. This is not a metaphor that anyone will appreciate, but I have a 2-year-old, and I when I say not appreciate, I mean because I'm comparing high schoolers to 2-year-olds, that when we do cleanup at the end of the day, it is much easier for me or my wife to just clean the stuff up ourselves. We, at 32 years old, we're pretty good at picking stuff up. But the value of teaching our son to pick up after himself is worth the extra time that we put in, right? Showing him that this is how we wrap up the day is worth the extra time that we put in to clean up. In the same way that it's better to have students involved with something like this than it is to just follow that professional path, put on great events in and of themselves.
But you don't let his final product be the way that the house is set. Once he goes to bed, don't you finish it up?
I wouldn't say finish it up. I would say that we are working alongside him as he's cleaning up. So, I mean, for the stuff he's picking up, he's not that bad at it. But that's not to say that there's more cleanup to do. But what the part that he's able to do, we have him do.
Yeah.
Does that maybe that's the way to put it?
I guess it's if the part he's able to do and he doesn't do it, does it stay undone?
In the case of our son, we will. What's the way to say it politely? We will clean it up together, right? Like
you're gonna make sure it gets done.
Yes, that's what
he's
I mean.
not going to bed until the toys are in the box.
We're the one who we put him down. So if he hasn't cleaned up or we haven't cleaned up together, we're just not putting him down.
But and so if
in the student case, you would you should absolutely let something. You should give ownership to students, and we've never had the situation where they've just totally dropped the ball. But you should let that weight fall on them because it's their ownership of the event, such that then you can praise them when it's successful, give them all the credit for it because you haven't really done that much. So yes, absolutely, you should put them on the hook for planning whatever activities fall under student life. And if things don't come together, they don't come together. I think would be the answer to that.
So your job is just to field the negative emails that come when events don't quite pan out?
Again, that's never happened. And
really?
Where things haven't panned out, I would say they haven't. And again, following the metaphor of cleaning up with a 2-year-old, you're doing projects alongside them, but the goal is that they would be able to do them on their own. So you're training up students, and you have 100% turnover every 4 years. So the work of training is constant. So, I mean, that's part of the job. And training might take more time initially, but eventually...
Hopefully have 100% turnover every 4 years.
Yeah, you better, or else you got bigger problems going on at that point. Okay, so that's as much as is possible, having events and activities run by the students that you're working with. Again, if you look at student life in colleges, this is a very common feature where it's a student congress of college students who are putting on most of the events. You'll have a full-time staff person you're working with in addition to that, but having student involvement helps with people actually showing up to the events and stuff that you plan. So I think it's an important part of student life is having students do the work. Okay, that's it on the student side. So again, that's the focus on the students. To do that, it's building bridges to every student. It's then using those bridges to actually have tough conversations, confront students when they need to be, having an unconditional positive regard for who the students could be, and then ensuring that the structures of your school, that every student belongs. And then the last one I just went through is passing off responsibilities to students as much as possible to have them be engaged and involved. Moving on to the life piece of it. One of my, a thing that I don't find helpful, but that happens all the time, is that people will talk about some other school and the events that other school puts on, and then say, this other school does this, we should do something just like that. And I've almost never seen anything pan out from ideas that start with, this other school does it and we should do it also. This is an Aquinas thing, the word quiddity. Have you heard the word quiddity before? Do you know what that is?
I've heard the word, and isn't there a podcast called Quiddity and something?
Oh, it's probably, I think it's a Cersei podcast, actually. So quiddity is like the essence of a thing. It's like the wetness of an object. It's what makes things unique from other things. And each school should have a quiddity. Veritas as a school is different from other schools. And so therefore, the events that you plan, the activities that you do, again, this is the life piece of it, have to be different from other schools. And so just because another school has an event that students are super engaged in, that sounds really cool, you think would have certain results that you want to see in your students, doesn't mean that it would be a good fit at your school. In the same way that there are events that your school does that other schools should not adopt. So, for instance, we have an event called Defender Pretender. What is Defender Pretender?
It's like a weird man pageant.
Yeah, that's a piece of it. That's the Mr. Defender part of it.
And then there's also some sort of sporting event, like a football game.
Powder puff.
Kickball this year.
Kickball.
Please switch to kickball, that's right.
Yeah. It's kind of a weird thing.
It is a weird thing, yes. So
But people love it. Yes. I look forward to it all year.
Yeah. Historically, it had been a powder puff football game, which I know when I describe it this way, it sounds pretty standard. It's changed since then. This year, it was quick kickball.
Too many injuries.
The injuries were unfortunate. And so girls play a sport to begin with, and then the boys have a pageant afterwards where they'll do a modeling portion and then a talent. But describing it that way makes it sound like pretty standard fare for things that high schools do. I don't know how often desks will be banged in with a bat, or people will turn from Julius Caesar into a sandwich, or like there are weird skits that go on as a part of the man pageant that they're referencing. But that works because of the school that the event is happening at, and it wouldn't necessarily translate to some other school.
It's weirdly low risk.
What do you mean?
Like I feel like if I had done some of the stuff that goes on that stage at my school, I went to a public school, then I would never live it down, right?
Yes.
Because our school is a pretty accepting school and one where we don't take kindly to people ragging hard on each other, there's lower risk to get up there and make a fool of yourself because nobody's going to remind you of it every day.
Yes, but if another school were a more refined school, I'm not making a positive or negative regard either way, but I could imagine a school that's more about...
If we were fancy.
That's what I mean. Like if there were a school that was more about etiquette and culture, and and an event like this wouldn't work. And I'm not saying one's better or one's worse.
It's just part of the quiddity.
But you have to know the quiddity of the place to then say, this is what fits in here, and as opposed to what fits in other places. The quiddity of Veritas is pretty quirky, and as you can tell from the events that we're talking about right now. And so sometimes ideas that are more solemn just don't fit in with the quiddity of Veritas. And that's the only point that I'm trying to make. You have to know what is the uniqueness of your school. And then the events that you're planning should match with that uniqueness. And I understand that you might want to shape it and move it in certain directions, but you won't have buy-in if it doesn't match with the existing wetness of the school. Mm-hmm. So that's point the first.
The shifting of a quiddity of a school is an interesting concept as well, because it will move over a long period of time of the school. And the question is, are you going to be active in directing it, or are you going to let it kind of like grow or metastasize on its own? So I think there always needs to be some kind of telos of what you want to be, or some sort of aim that you're aiming for. And then there's always the organic allow it to grow. I mean, and this, as the student body comes and goes, yes, a culture is passed down, but it also changes, and it's an interesting thing.
Let's go with that. I'll go out of order. So what you're describing, there's a fancy name for that called emergence. I don't know if that's a word that you've heard before. I was introduced to this. I think I've told you all that I try and take college classes every semester. And a few semesters ago, it was biology classes I was taking. And there's this property in biology that as you move up the chain of biological stuff, you have these new properties that just show up all of a sudden. So at the very bottom, you have atoms. Atoms combine together to become molecules. Molecules combine together to become cells. And at the cellular point, you have this emergent property of life. Molecules are not alive, and cells are. So by somehow these molecules gathering together, something happens, and then life occurs. Right? That's the biological way of understanding life. Well, in the same way that goes up the chain, that cells are different from tissues, tissues are different from organs, organs are different from humans, right? Well, that chain continues up where there are traits of one person that, as you add more people, you develop other emergent traits. There are emergent traits of groups of people. This would be like society, or a word that I kind of hate, but I think is the appropriate one, is culture. So culture is this emergent property that you have as you get more and more people together. There's a certain way that that group of people will tend to act. And that's what I would, in rough terms, call culture. And so in thinking about this thing, culture, and in thinking about what Graham just talked about of shaping culture or quiddity or the uniqueness of a place, one way of thinking about that is I want to go after the culture of a place, and I want to fix the culture of a place. But I think it's really hard because it's an amorphous thing, and it's hard to think about what does it mean to change the culture of a place. Well, if we're following this idea of emergency, you know what I mean, of emergence, you don't have to go after culture only at that level of groups. You can focus on the smaller levels from that, and that's at the level of the person. So by which I mean, since the idea of changing a culture is a large thing, you can more easily focus on people who are showing a culture that you don't like. Does that make sense? Who are making decisions that are not conducive to a culture that you would like to have, or a quiddity that you would like to have. Or
conversely, you can also focus on building up virtue in the individual person, yes, and then having a body of virtuous individuals, some sort of virtuous emergence will come.
Yes, I agree with that. Though I would say that the biggest input into what that culture or that quiddity will be is who you let in the door. And so being really, again, this is outside of student life, but just a thing to be conscious of is if you're at a school where you're able to be selective of who's there, those decisions of the teachers, the administration, the staff, the students, that's what's going to shape the direction of the school, because culture is made up of these individuals.
It's like when we let that third member into this podcast, AJ, all those episodes ago.
Totally just destroyed things. I've totally destroyed the quiddity of this podcast. I definitely agree with that.
The quiddity was AJ and I huddled together on one chair because we only had one microphone. Basically cheek to cheek in both senses of the word. And just talking about...
We would talk together, we'd get sick together because we were breathing each other's air.
That's disgusting, actually. Yep. I'm glad that we are now further apart. You're welcome.
You're talking about culture.
You're
bacterial culture.
Bacterial culture, quite clearly.
Oh my gosh.
The events, the life of the school is going to be unique to it. That's the quiddity. And then that culture is an emergent property. And the way to get at culture is through individuals would be the way that I would summarize that. The next one, student life is one piece of a broader mission of the school. And that's a thing that always has to be kept in mind. One of my favorite resources over the last few years was Dr. Walt Mueller. He is the president of the Center for Parent Youth Understanding. How do you like that for a title? He has a couple podcasts. One of them is Youth Culture Matters. And years ago, he had a podcast about how within churches, a majority, I forget the exact number, but it was like 90% of church conflict originates in the youth group was the thing that he was commenting on.
That's hilarious.
In what way? Like,
Oh, it's just I don't know. It's just there's that's where all the like there's energy and lack of filters, a lot of hormones, and kids are like, we gotta shake this up. We need drums in the worship band.
Well, I mean also that it was the staff. Their complex statement was about youth pastors and the entire church, and but it's the same idea of youth pastors spending all this time with students who want to change things, which motivates the youth pastor to want to change lots of things. Mm-hmm. And their point is, a problem. There are lots of questions about like a youth ministry within a church, which I don't want to go into, but you essentially have a pastor within you have a church within a church, I guess I would say, which creates certain problems. That's the point of that podcast. But just to say that,
I think it's a great idea to make a church out of totally immature people with lots of hormones flying around. It seems awesome.
And you give them a lot of say in the church by having,
But you want engagement.
Yes, exactly. But how has that engagement panned out? The only point to say is that at a school, student life exists alongside many other parts of the school.
Yeah, and faculty life.
What's that? Yeah.
Faculty.
Well, I think a ministry to teachers, I think it would be an important.
What you're saying maybe is that you think they should bring us muffins every morning, and I'm not going to disagree with you.
I appreciate that.
Every time I walk in the classroom, I want my students to stand up and say, "Good morning, Mr. Donaldson." Has yet to happen. I put it out there every year.
No one does it. No, I mean more that a part of me being on this podcast is like a sign that I'm not just here to be the fun guy. Speaking of bacteria from before, is that like. What drew me to Veritas in the first place was classical education. It wasn't, I want to put on big dances because dances are fun. It's that the work of the school academically is important, and in whatever way this student life piece can support the mission of the school, that's a thing that I wanted to be a part of for 5 years and was. So just from talking with other people in student life, it's just being very conscientious that you are not the center of the school. You are not the point of the school. The emergent work that all of you are doing together is the point. And that involves athletics, fine arts, academics. It involves the entire school. And it's not just you being the white knight making changes that you think are interesting to the school. And again, this is just something, I've just talked with a lot of people over 5 years who think that the only thing that the school is about is student life. And it's definitely not. Following on with that is that even at your most effective in that student piece from before, you are not a replacement for the larger web of influences that a student has. And again, be this in the college or the high school level, whichever student you're working with, they have a family. If you're in the Christian setting like we are, they have a church. And, even if you spend an hour a week with students, like in a mentorship relationship thing, that pales in comparison to what these are rough numbers I ran through, but it's probably 7 hours a day is that 8 hours a day that they're with their family, 56 hours, 50 or 60 hours that they're with their family a week, probably 40 hours that they're in classes or doing homework, maybe is a high estimate. But it just pales in comparison to the rest of what they have going on. And so I just think it's anyone who's in this ministry work needs to not think too much of what they're doing. I don't want them to think too little. Your work is important, but don't think too much of, if you don't say the exact right word, this child is going to be crushed and they're not going to work through an issue. They have lots of other resources and things are going to be okay for these people. You should do your work. You should try and build these bridges like I'm saying, but you shouldn't be too worried about you make one misstep and then an entire student's life falls apart. That's not how these things are going to work. I don't know if you all feel this.
Yeah, you only have them for 4 years,
yeah.
Right? I mean, I will probably only teach students directly for 2,
right,
which isn't a lot of time.
Right.
I mean, even in the scheme of things, I have them for 3 hours a week,
right,
for
2 years.
For 2 years, something like that. It's not great.
Which even in our high school context doesn't include summers, right? So it's only 9 months out of the year.
Sure. If you're lucky, you can have an impact, and I think
72 hours in the class.
Yeah, it's a good idea to remember that some of their biggest moments, think back to myself. Some of my biggest moments happened before high school and in college.
Yes.
And so my poor high school teachers were killing themselves, and
yes,
some of my greatest moments were just hanging out with friends, and those are the lessons that I take.
I would not be able to name all of my high school teachers from 9th grade to 12th grade in a row.
Not even close.
Me neither. And so again, I don't want to like take that too far and be like, you shouldn't care about the work that you're doing if you work at a school, but you should, if you're a teacher, you should get your...
You shouldn't care about the harvest. You care about the sowing.
Yeah, sure.
You just do the right thing consistently, and you can't worry about how the thing is going to land or how it's going to grow.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that you care about the sowing. You care about doing that faithfully.
So then in the same vein as that, so even at your most effective, you're only one piece of a much larger web of influences. The final point then. So if putting all your time into student life work or ministry work it'd be overkill to just only do that all the time, then what should you be doing? And I've worked in nonprofits for a long time. In college, I worked for an educational nonprofit here in Austin, and one of my manager at the time told this story about being in the Peace Corps and how I think she worked, I don't remember where she worked as a part of the Peace Corps, somewhere international, and she would see these people get so frustrated in the Peace Corps because they were there to like turn entire countries around. Like that was their goal, was this country is in poverty and there's poor education and healthcare is bad. I'm going to be a piece of fixing all those things. And no one person is going to accomplish that.
Would that it were so simple.
Would that it were so simple.
Yeah.
But that the people who were, I don't know what that's from.
Sorry. Oh, that's right. Sorry. It's from a movie.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Movies are great. But the people who were not frustrated out of their minds were the ones who were there to either learn something or were there for the experience of 2 years being in somewhere international and doing work that mattered. But then their concern was, I'm going to be here for 2 years and do the work that I should do, not I'm going to have this giant outcome.
It's shouldering like some sort of messiah complex, or I'm going to
I'm going to be the one who fixes this thing. Yeah. Thousands of years before me, whatever state is there hasn't been able to do it. I'm going to be the one to turn it around. Doesn't work. So then what should your view be toward this work of either ministry or student life? Is that if it's your full-time vocation, there should be a certain level to which you say it is a job where there are hours that you put into it. There are boundaries that you put on that work. And then outside of that work, you should live a full life. That we've talked many times about how a purpose of education is to make little copies of yourself. And that if that's true, then you should be becoming the best version of yourself, which would be if you want the kids that you work with to grow up to get married and have children, you should get married and have children. If you think that the students you work with should have close relationships where they have great friendships with people, you should have great friendships and spend lots of time with those people. You should not have higher expectations on the students that you work with than you do on yourself, I guess is one way to put it. And that you should be enforcing those expectations on yourself with your free time outside of the school to be becoming that kind of person that you'd want them to look up to and be like.
If gold does rust, what shall iron do? Yeah. Right? It's from Canterbury Tales. Yeah. The priest is supposed to embody the lessons that he preaches. Yeah.
And I think that's, again, in this work of ministry, I think it's easy to focus on, like, I need these students to turn out a certain way and lose sight of who am I becoming as a part of this. So just, again, that's part of the don't overwork, don't have a good family life, have a good relationship with your husband or wife. Like that will matter a lot more to the work of ministry even itself. Okay, that's all the points that I'll run through again very quickly. Is that, again, this is just me reflecting on what I've learned from 5 years of being in student life. Student life ends up splitting into these two pieces of the student component, connections with students, and the life component, the events, the activities, the projects that you're putting on. On the student side, what I've always very much valued and think is important to this role is building bridges to every student, not just to the ones that you like off the bat. 2, then using those bridges to reach the students, to push them, to try and get them to the better versions of themselves. 3, to have an unconditional positive regard for the person that they could be, for the best version of that student. 4, building structures, building events, building things at the school where every student knows that they belong or could belong if they want to be involved. 5, getting students involved in the planning and putting on of events as much as is possible. 6, seeing the uniqueness of the place where you work, the quiddity of the place where you work, and putting on events that meet that quiddity, meet that uniqueness. 7, viewing culture more as an emergent property wherein you can have impacts on the students, on the individuals, and that will have impacts on the culture instead of going after culture directly, because I don't know if that's a thing you can really do. 8, seeing student life as just one piece of a broader mission of whatever institution that you're a part of, be that a college, be that a high school, be that whatever. 9, even at your most effective, you're just one part of a larger web of influences on that given student, which then leads into 10, watch how your time is spent. Make sure that you're becoming the type of person that you would want your students to become as they grow up. That is what I got.
That's good. I feel like there's like so many other directions that we should continue on with this, but we're out of time.
I mean, it's also more than just a good look into student life. A lot of those principles could be applied to all leadership.
Totally.
Right?
I agree with that.
Focus on the individual. If you want culture to change, then you have to change people in the small. And then if you want a big shift, you have to start that by moving small blocks.
Yes. Cool. You all have already said this. Some of this doesn't apply to teachers specifically.
Well, there's already sort of built-in expectations and roles that are different and that are, I don't know.
But I know I can't remember who the professor is who I heard this from, but an older professor was talking with a younger professor. The younger professor was talking about how he hated this one student who was always distracted in class, didn't have anything interesting to say. And again, this is in a college setting. And the older professor said, I forget I think it was, what is the student's name? And the younger professor didn't know the student's name. It was just, a classroom of 100 people, and all they knew was it's the annoying kid who sits in the third row. And so what the older teacher said to the younger teacher was, learn the student's name and greet them every day that they walk into your classroom. And so he did that, and it totally turned things around because it no longer was, I'm anonymous face in the crowd. I am Steve. I don't remember the guy's name. I'm Steve, who my teacher knows, and I'm on the hook for how I act.
No, maybe distance learning is the future.
There are parts of it where I think it makes a lot of sense, and but for what you all do, I don't think distance learning would work. But
I would hate it.
Yeah.
I don't think I could continue to do it. Like, I would have to quit my job.
But there are
just get robust
homeschooling teachers that focus on online and have a lot of success through that.
You would have to completely rethink the school. Like, it's a completely different. You would have to completely rethink everything.
I just get exhausted. I have a hard time staring at blank screens when the kids turn their cameras off. It's just hard.
Sure.
Like, distance is hard.
Cool.
All right, that's all I got.
Awesome. Well, this has been classical stuff
Graham.
you should know.
Keep doing
it. Graham's ready to end this episode.
Just you can take it away there, big guy.
This has been classical stuff you should know. Sorry. Thanks for listening. Hey, it's totally cool. I love that enthusiasm. You can find us online at classicalstuff.net. You can tweet at us at CLSSCAL stuff. You can email us at theguys@classicalstuff.net. And you can support us on Patreon if you like at Patreon/classicalstuff.
Patreon.com.
Patreon.com/classicalstuff. That's a place where you can find our in-between episodes and extra little goodies that we put out for you, access to talks we do for conferences and that sort of thing. And when we have sponsors, that's where our ad-free episodes show up, and you can get those at the lowest level. So if you want to support what we're doing, you are welcome. If not, then hey, we're still going to keep making episodes, so you can keep on tuning in every week, except for maybe 1 week in July, because I'm going to be taking a break up in Washington. So when I get back is kind of still up in the air. There might be 1 week in July when we don't have an episode up, and that might come directly after this episode. So if you're listening to this next week, there may not be an episode. So if one doesn't show up, that's all part of the plan. Okay, and that's it for us. So this is Classical Stuff signing off.
Bye.